Now, science-based targets are really sort of the talking point amongst many of our clients at the moment. Several large companies have already committed to set an emissions reduction target which is based on science, hence science-based targets, as a consequence of the COP21 Paris Agreement. I think there's something around 400 companies globally currently have signed the commitment. Of those, just over 100 as we speak have actually had their science-based targets approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative. IMS works closely with clients to help them to achieve science-based targets, and what we've found, because most of the businesses who are on that journey have fairly sort of complex carbon accounting and management processes, it seems that the scope 3 aspect of science-based targets is the real difficult thing to get your head around. Andrew, if you have more than 40% of your total emissions are scope 3, then you have to do something about those.
Yes, that's right. So as a minimum, you have to do what's called a screening. So you estimate there are 15 categories of scope 3 emissions, and you have to estimate at least roughly where the biggest emissions are so that you can prioritise which scope 3 targets to put in place. And you have to put in place a target for your 3 biggest hitters, your 3 biggest areas of scope 3 emissions.
So it varies from company to company?
Yes, indeed, yes. And some companies have already measured quite a lot of their scope 3 emissions, but even in those cases, sometimes they leave out the things related to product use, the product use phase, for example.
Okay, but Victoria, scope 3 has always been the difficulty, hasn't it? Because it's not entirely within the control of the business, and I think that seems to put people off the idea of science-based targets, because they feel that they've got to actually manage the whole of their scope 3 portfolio, as it were.
Yeah, people are definitely put off by the idea of having to go to each and every one of their suppliers and ask them what their emissions are, especially when these are one of the main issues is people dealing with a lot of small suppliers, and like they're not gonna have any idea what their emissions are. But that's sort of one step beyond what they need to do. What they're being asked to do is to at least start doing something, to at least start looking at the main sources of scope 3 emissions, and just estimate it as well. There are several ways of getting around that issue, at least at the start, and start to get an idea of where the biggest sources of scope 3 emissions are, and that's all they're being asked to do at this stage.
So you're not expected to set an absolute target then?
No, not yet, not at this stage anyway. And
no, I mean it's quite right. I mean you can use spend data, so your annual spend on your biggest suppliers to estimate your emissions. So it's not always quite as complex or demanding as some companies think, in terms of you don't need to contact all your suppliers for their emissions.
Okay. And Andrew, we've just completed, I think this is the second of our science-based target submissions, which has been successful. We're now working on the third for another client. What's your experience of the relationship with the Science-Based Targets Initiative?
Yeah, it's at the moment it is demanding. There are a lot of hurdles to cross, so you do need to make sure that you tick all the boxes in terms of the criteria that they place in terms of that submission. And then the next thing to expect is, even if you've been through a very thorough process in terms of setting your targets, expect to get questions back. Expect to possibly have to negotiate a little bit on some of those targets.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.